Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. On the morning of June 12, 1962, a guard at Alcatraz walked into a cell, leaned over a sleeping inmate, and shook him by the shoulder. The head rolled off the pillow. It was painted papier-mâché, fitted with real human hair, and the nose had broken off when the guard prodded it. Frank Morris was already gone. So were John and Clarence Anglin in the cells next to him. And in the 64 years since that morning, nobody has ever proven for certain what happened to those three men. Alcatraz was supposed to be the prison that ended escape stories. It sat on a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay, the water around it freezing and riptide-laced. And it was the place the federal system sent inmates who were too violent, too clever, or too prone to running for any other facility to handle. Al Capone had served time there. So had Robert Stroud, the Birdman. By the early 1960s, no one had ever successfully escaped, and the guards were confident that nobody ever would. Frank Morris arrived in January 1960. He was 33 years old, orphaned at 11, raised in a string of foster homes, and reportedly had an IQ of 133. His record was a long list of bank robberies, burglaries, and escape attempts from other prisons. The Anglin brothers came later. John in October 1960, Clarence in January 1961. They were two of 14 children born to poor Georgia farmers, and they were doing time for a 1958 bank robbery in Columbia, Alabama. All three men had crossed paths years earlier at the Atlanta penitentiary. They recognized each other. They started talking. The planning began in late 1961. Their cells happened to back onto a narrow utility corridor that ran behind the cell block, sealed off by a concrete wall with a small ventilation grate at the base. If they could widen that grate, they could slip into the corridor unseen. So they got to work. They used spoons from the mess hall, saw blades smuggled in by other inmates, and a drill they had built themselves out of a stolen vacuum cleaner motor. The noise was a problem, so Morris would practice his accordion during the evening music hour to cover it. They painted cardboard the color of the cell wall and propped it over the holes whenever a guard walked by. Once they could move freely into the utility corridor, they climbed up to an unused space above the cell block and built a workshop on the roof. That was where they made the raft. It was roughly 6 feet by 14 feet, sewn together from more than 50 stolen prison-issue raincoats, the seams vulcanized on the hot steam pipes that ran through the ceiling. They built life vests the same way. They modified a concertina to use as a bellows for inflation, and they made the heads, 4 of them in total, painted, shaped, fitted with hair collected from the prison barbershop, propped on pillows under blankets to fool the night count. There was a 4th man in on the plan, an inmate named Alan West, who couldn't quite get his grill loose in time and was left behind. He later told the FBI everything. On the night of June 11th, 1962, Morris and the Anglins climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof. A guard heard a loud crash and didn't investigate. They slid roughly 50 feet down a kitchen vent pipe to the ground, scaled 2 12-foot barbed wire fences, and launched the raft from a stretch of shoreline that sat in the searchlight's blind spot. That was the last time anyone saw them. The next morning, when the heads rolled, the FBI launched what would become a 17-year manhunt. They interviewed every relative of every man. They alerted boat operators up and down the coast. An oar was eventually found near Angel Island. So were shredded pieces of raincoat material. On December 31st, 1979, the Bureau officially closed its file, concluding that the 3 men had most likely drowned in the bay. They handed the case over to the U.S. Marshals Service, and the Marshals' investigation remains open to this day. That should have been the end of it. But in 2018, the FBI disclosed a letter it had received years earlier, claiming to be from John Anglin. The writer said all three of them had survived the swim, but barely. He claimed Morris and Clarence had since died of various illnesses, and that he himself was dying of cancer. He offered to turn himself in for medical treatment. The FBI tested it for fingerprints and DNA. The results were inconclusive. And in November 2025, the YouTuber Mark Robber gathered a team that included Johnny Harris, Cleo Abram, and Adam Savage, and they recreated the entire escape using only the magazine articles and materials the inmates had access to. They built the raft on the cell block roof. They rowed out from the same shoreline. They reached the Golden Gate Bridge. The escape, in other words, was physically possible. 64 years on, the most famous prison break in American history is still officially unsolved. If you think Alcatraz was the high watermark for escape ingenuity, the next case will adjust that opinion. Because in France, one man turned helicopter extraction into a personal specialty, and he didn't do it once. Pascal Payet. There is a French armed robber named Pascal Payet who holds a record that nobody else in modern criminal history has come close to. He has escaped from French maximum security prisons 3 separate times, every one of them by helicopter. The last escape happened on Bastille Day, 2007, and the whole operation was finished in under 5 minutes. Payet was born July 7, 1963, in the southern French city of Montpellier, and grew up between Lyon and Marseille. On November 20, 1997, he took part in an armored car robbery in Salon de Provence, in which a security guard was shot and killed. He was arrested with an accomplice named Eric Alboreo in Paris in January 1999. In January 2005, he was sentenced to 30 years for the guard's murder, a verdict upheld on appeal a year later. The first helicopter escape came before that final conviction. On October 12, 2001, while Payet was being held at Louin's prison in the south of France, a small chartered helicopter was hijacked at gunpoint and forced to land inside the prison grounds. Payet boarded with a fellow inmate named Frederick Impocco, and the helicopter lifted off again before guards on the ground could react. The first time, in other words, was the easy one. He was on the run for several months before authorities caught him. And this is the part of the story that doesn't quite scan the first time you hear it. While he was still a fugitive, Payet personally organized a second helicopter raid on the exact same prison. On April 14, 2003, accomplices working under his direction hijacked another aircraft and used it to free 3 of his old associates from Louinas, including Eric Alboreo, the man who had been arrested alongside him in 1999. All 3 were recaptured within roughly 3 weeks, but the operation still happened. In January 2007, Payet confessed to organizing the second escape and received an additional 7 years on top of the 6 he had already been given for his own escape. That's not a typo, by the way. He was caught, sentenced, and re-imprisoned, and then he did it again. By the summer of 2007, the French prison administration had classified him as a particularly closely watched prisoner. He was being moved between facilities every few months, specifically to prevent another rescue, and at the time of the third escape, he was in solitary confinement at Grasse Prison on the French Riviera. On the morning of July 14, 2007, the French national holiday, 4 masked men hijacked a helicopter from the airport at Cannes-Mandelieu. They forced the pilot to fly to Grasse. They landed on the roof of the prison, blew through the doors of the solitary wing, pulled Payet out, and were back in the air before guards had finished radioing for backup. The whole operation, from the airport hijacking to the final pickup, lasted under 5 minutes. The pilot, who had been chartered for what he believed was a routine tourism flight that morning, was put through an ordeal that lasted under an hour from start to finish. The masked men in the cabin gave him instructions throughout. Land here, take off now, hold position. Once the rescue at Grasse was complete, the aircraft flew to a field outside the town of Brignoles, where Payet and the others transferred to waiting vehicles. The pilot was released unharmed and immediately reported the entire sequence to French police. By then, of course, it was already too late. The manhunt that followed was the largest in modern French history for a single fugitive. He was finally captured on September 21, 2007, in Mataró, a town near Barcelona, where Spanish police traced him through a network of associates. He was returned to French custody on October 4th and immediately moved to a secret location whose name has never been publicly confirmed. In June 2008, he received an additional 15 years for a string of armed robberies and assaults on police officers committed while he was on the run. In April 2011, the courts handed him another 5 years specifically for the 2007 escape. He remains in a high-security French prison today, still classified as the most heavily monitored inmate in the system. The detail that always sticks with people about Payet's story isn't the engineering, it's the math. He didn't break out once. He broke out, helped break someone else out while he was free, got caught, and then broke out again. You'd think someone in the French prison system would have said something after the second one. Nobody did. And when they finally moved him every 6 months, they were essentially admitting that the building couldn't hold him. Only the schedule could. But Payet wasn't even the first French inmate to discover that the weakest point in a maximum security prison is the airspace above it. That distinction belongs to a man who, 2 decades earlier, was rescued in broad daylight from the roof of the most famous prison in Paris. And he wasn't rescued by accomplices. He was rescued by his wife. Michel Vaujour. In 1983, a French woman walked into a flight school in the town of Annecy and signed up for helicopter lessons. She wasn't training for a career, and she wasn't taking it up as a hobby. She was learning to fly so she could lift her husband off the roof of La Santé prison in central Paris. And 3 years later, on May 26, 1986, that's exactly what she did. Michel Vaujour was born January 16, 1951, in the small town of Saint-Quentin-le-Petit in the northeast of France. He was abandoned as a child and spent his teenage years in and out of juvenile facilities. By the time he was an adult, he was a professional armed robber, with convictions stretching back through most of his 20s for everything from bank holdups to an attempted homicide. He had also already escaped from custody on 3 separate occasions before 1986. By the time of the helicopter rescue, he was serving an 18-year sentence in the high-security wing of La Santé prison, one of the most secure facilities in France. His wife Nadine started her flying lessons under her maiden name. She paid cash, kept to herself, and worked her way through certifications at a flight school in Annecy, then later at a rental firm closer to Paris. She did this for 3 years, becoming a regular and unremarkable customer, the kind of low-profile client that nobody at the airfield would have flagged. And in May 1986, she booked a helicopter for the morning of the 26th. At roughly 10:30 in the morning, Nadine took off from a small airfield outside Paris and flew 19 miles into the center of the city. Inside La Santé, Michel and his cellmate Pierre Hernandez had made their way to the prison roof. They were carrying what appeared to be hand grenades. In reality, they were nectarines, painted by Michel in his cell over the previous weeks to look like the real thing. When Nadine's helicopter appeared overhead, ignoring repeated radio warnings from traffic control, Michelle waved the painted nectarines at the prison guards, who froze. Nobody fired. Michelle grabbed the helicopter's skid and was lifted clear of the rooftop. Hernandez panicked at the last second, lost his nerve, and surrendered to the guards still standing on the roof. Nadine flew the helicopter to a nearby athletic field where the couple landed, abandoned the aircraft, and fled by car. The escape was televised within hours, and the French public, who had no context for any of this, learned that a woman in her 30s had just airlifted her armed robber husband out of a prison rooftop using fruit as a weapon. And no, I'm not making that up. The aftermath was less cinematic. A few months later, during a botched bank robbery in Paris, Michel was shot in the head by police. He survived a weeks-long coma, but emerged from it partially impaired, with significant cognitive and motor deficits. He was returned to a high-security prison, where he served another 17 years, much of it in isolation. Nadine was identified through the rental paperwork at the flight school, where she had used an alias, Lena Rigo. She was arrested, tried, and imprisoned for her role in the escape. Michelle was finally released in 2003, after serving 27 years total behind bars, 17 of those in solitary confinement. His release was the result of a record sentence reduction, the largest any French inmate had received at that time, granted partly because of his condition after the shooting. He became a painter and an author in the years after his release. In 2018, he published a memoir titled L'amour m'a sauvé du naufrage, which translates roughly to Love saved me from the wreckage. By then, he and Nadine had separated. The escape itself was later loosely adapted into the French film La Fille de l'air. The detail that lands hardest about the Vaujour case is the timeline. Nadine spent 3 years learning to fly a helicopter because she had decided, at some point, that this was the only way to get her husband back. There was no contingency plan and no plan B. The painted nectarines were the entire bluff that the operation depended on. And the only reason any of it worked is because the guards on the roof, looking up at a helicopter that wasn't supposed to be there, and a man holding what looked like grenades, did the math in real time and decided that whatever they were about to do, it wasn't worth getting blown up over. By the time they realized the fruit was fruit, the helicopter was already gone. If 3 years of training for a single rescue sounds like a lot of patience, the next story will recalibrate that as well. Because in Greece, there is a bank robber whose helicopter escape wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part is that he did it twice from the same prison, and 17 years later, he is still gone. Vasilis Palaiokostas. Greek police have spent the better part of 2 decades looking for a bank robber named Vasilis Palaiokostas. They have offered roughly €1 million for information leading to his capture. They have fired prison directors and justice ministry officials over his name. They have raided villages, monitored ports, and tracked down associates across Europe. And as of the summer of 2026, they still have no idea where he is. Palaiokostas was born May 17, 1966, in a small mountain village called Moschofito, near the city of Trikala in central Greece. His family kept sheep. He left school early, and by his late teens, was running bank robberies and kidnappings alongside his older brother, Nikos. The two of them developed a reputation in certain Greek media circles as Robin Hood figures, with reports that they distributed some of their stolen money to poor families in their home region. Some of those stories check out, particularly the ones connected to Nikos. Others are anecdotal and likely exaggerated. In 2000, Palaiokostas was sentenced to 25 years for the 1995 kidnapping of Alexander Haitoglu, the CEO of the Haidoglu Brothers Food Company. He was incarcerated at Korydallos prison in Athens, the largest correctional facility in Greece. On June 4, 2006, that prison became the site of what was, at the time, the most audacious escape in modern Greek history. A sightseeing helicopter was hijacked from the Athens area of Agios Kosmas, using a pistol and a hand grenade. The pilot was forced to fly to Korydallos and land in the prison yard. Guards on the ground, accustomed to occasional official inspection flights, didn't react quickly enough. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Palaiokostas and an Albanian inmate named Alket Rizai had climbed aboard, and the helicopter was lifting off again. It landed shortly afterward at a nearby cemetery, where the two men switched to waiting motorcycles and disappeared into the city. The operation is widely believed to have been organized by Vasilis's brother Nikos, though the full crew has never been formally identified. Palaiokostas spent the next 2 years on the run, reportedly living in safe houses across Greece. He was finally recaptured on August 2, 2008, in Thessaloniki. According to officers who arrested him, his only comment was that he had played and he had lost, and that they were victorious. He was returned to Korydallos to await trial. What happened next is the part that broke the Greek prison system. On February 22, 2009, the day before his trial was scheduled to begin, a helicopter appeared over Korydallos again. This time there was no pretense of an inspection. A rope ladder was dropped from the aircraft. Palaiokostas and Alket Rizai, both already waiting in the exercise yard, climbed up. A female passenger inside the helicopter opened fire on guards with an automatic rifle. One officer, in the confusion, injured himself drawing his own weapon. The helicopter, riddled with return fire and visibly damaged, lifted off anyway. It was found abandoned a short time later. Palaiokostas and Rizai were gone again. The political fallout was severe. The Greek Justice Ministry fired 3 of its officials. The director of Korydallos was removed. Several guards were arrested on suspicion of complicity. The country had now watched the same prisoner escape from the same prison, by the same method, with the same cellmate, on consecutive escape attempts. You'd think someone would have said something after the first one. Nobody did. Or if they did, nobody listened. Alket Rizai was caught again in November of 2009. Palaiokostas was not. While he was on the run, Greek police tied him to the June 2008 kidnapping of the industrialist Georgos Melonas, whose family ultimately paid a ransom estimated in the millions of euro to secure his release. That ransom money, much of it never recovered, is widely believed to be the financial cushion that has allowed Palaiokostas to stay hidden for so long. He has not been seen since. Greek media has long called him the uncatchable, sometimes also rendered in English as the Phantom. Reports periodically surface that he has been spotted in different countries. None have ever been confirmed. In 2022, the anarchist publishing house Freedom Press released an English translation of a memoir he is believed to have written while in hiding, titled A Normal Life. The book contains personal reflections, descriptions of his upbringing, and his own account of the escapes, though it offers no usable information about where he has been since 2009. His brother Nikos, who served 16 years for 16 separate bank robberies, died in 2025. As of the summer of 2026, the warrant for Vasilis Palaiokostas remains active, the bounty for his capture is still posted, and Greek police have effectively conceded that they do not know whether he is in the country, in Europe, or somewhere else entirely. The fact that he has remained hidden for so long, in an era of biometric surveillance and international cooperation, is part of why his case is still discussed. The next escape on this list isn't quite as unresolved. The man at the center of it was eventually caught. But the path he took to get out, and what he did once he was free, makes everything else on this list look comparatively understated. Redouane Faïd. Redouane Faïd used to tell people that American crime movies were his training manual. Films like Heat and Scarface and Reservoir Dogs weren't entertainment to him. They were technical reference. He once told the director Michael Mann, in person, that Mann had effectively been his consultant on a career of armed robberies. And when Faïd walked out of a French maximum security prison on the morning of July 1st, 2018, the entire operation looked like a film he had been rehearsing for years. Faïd was born May 10, 1972, in the city of Creil, north of Paris, to Algerian immigrant parents. His father deserted the family in 1988. His mother died of leukemia in 1991. By his early 20s, he was already a professional armed robber, working with crews that targeted armored vans and high-value cash transfers across northern France. He published an autobiography in 2010 titled Braqueur, which translates loosely to robber, in which he openly cited the American crime films he had watched as a teenager as the source of his methods. He was serving a 25-year sentence for his role in a botched 2010 armored car robbery in which a young policewoman named Aurélie Fouquet was killed. Faïd maintained that he had not personally fired the shot that killed her, but his crew had been responsible for the operation, and he received the full sentence. He had also already escaped from a French prison once. On April 13, 2013, while being held at Sequedin prison in the north of France, Faïd used hidden explosives to blast through 5 separate sets of doors and took 4 prison wardens hostage as human shields on his way out. He was on the run for roughly 6 weeks before being recaptured on May 29th in a hotel in Ponteau-Combourg, just outside Paris. After that first escape, he was moved to Réau, a maximum security facility south of Paris, with significantly increased monitoring. It did not help. On the morning of July 1st, 2018, at around 11:30, 2 men posing as flight school students boarded a small helicopter at a French aviation training center. Once the aircraft was airborne, they pulled weapons on the flight instructor and ordered him to fly to Réau prison. The helicopter landed in the visitors' courtyard of the facility. Faïd's brother Rashid, who had taken the pilot hostage at gunpoint, stayed with the aircraft. Other accomplices on the ground used smoke bombs and angle grinders to cut through reinforced doors and reach the area where Faïd was being held. Inside the prison, witnesses later reported that other inmates applauded as Faïd was escorted to the helicopter. The operation took roughly 10 minutes from landing to liftoff. The aircraft, an Aerospatiale Alouette 2, was found abandoned north of Paris shortly afterward. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in recent French history. Faïd was reportedly seen at various points across northern France over the following 3 months. On July 24th, a major operation near Paris came close to capturing him, but failed. During the search, French police released photographs suggesting he had been moving around in a burqa, which he had used as a disguise to pass through security checkpoints unnoticed. He was finally recaptured on October 3, 2018, in Creil, the town where he had been born, hiding in an apartment a short distance from his family's old neighborhood. His trial for the 2018 escape concluded on October 26, 2023. He was sentenced to 14 years for the escape itself, a term reduced from the 22 years the prosecution had requested. During his testimony, Faïd described the moment of the escape in unusually lyrical terms. He spoke about a ray of sunshine hitting him as he climbed into the helicopter, and about the feeling of freedom in those seconds before the doors closed. The judges, by all accounts, were not moved. His brother Rachid received a 10-year sentence for his role in taking the helicopter pilot hostage. 3 nephews who participated in the operation received sentences of 2, 6, and 8 years, respectively. When you add up the original 25-year sentence for the policewoman's death, the additional time for the 2013 escape, and the 14 years for the 2018 escape, the minimum term Fayed is currently serving runs to roughly the year 2060. He is, by every reasonable definition, never going to see the outside of a French prison again. And somehow it gets worse for him personally, because the conditions under which he is now held have been described in court filings as the most restrictive long-term confinement currently used in the French correctional system. He is moved between facilities frequently, kept in extended isolation, and monitored continuously. The lessons that the French prison administration apparently learned from Pascal Payet have been applied to Fayed in full. What makes his case stand out is the gap between the cinematic precision of the escapes and the very ordinary place where he was finally found. The man who had once compared his career to a Michael Mann screenplay was caught in an apartment a short walk from where he had grown up, with no helicopter, no crew, and no exit plan that would have worked. The film, in other words, had run out. If you're enjoying this video and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Joel David Kaplan. On the evening of August 18, 1971, most of the inmates and guards at Santa Martha Acatitla prison in Mexico City were watching a film. The lights were down. Attention was elsewhere. At roughly 6:35 in the evening, a small blue helicopter painted in the markings of the Mexican Attorney General's office descended into the prison yard. 2 men ran from the cell blocks, climbed in, and were back in the air in under 15 seconds. One of them was an American sugar heir named Joel David Kaplan, and the operation he had just walked out of would be cited for decades afterward as the first true helicopter prison break in modern history. Kaplan was an American businessman, heir to a large sugar and molasses fortune through his uncle's foundation. In 1962, he was arrested in Mexico for the murder of his business partner, a man named Luis Melchor Vidal Jr. He was convicted and sentenced to 28 years. He maintained throughout his life that he had been in Peru on the day of the killing and had nothing to do with it. The conviction would later become controversial for reasons that had little to do with the evidence at trial. In 1964, a U.S. congressional probe led by Representative Wright Patman determined that the J.M. Kaplan Fund, which was run by Kaplan's uncle Jacob, had been used as a secret conduit for Central Intelligence Agency money flowing into Latin America. That finding is documented in State Department archives and CIA records released under the Freedom of Information Act. The fund itself, in other words, had verifiable ties to American intelligence operations. Joel Kaplan's own lawyer would later claim that his client had personally been a CIA agent and that the murder charge in Mexico had been part of a setup. That part has never been proven and remains an allegation rather than a fact. The escape itself was organized by his sister, Judy, who hired a former pilot and freelance operative named Victor Statter to plan it. The family had already burned through several failed attempts, including a fake poultry farm with a tunnel underneath and a scheme involving a laundry truck. None of them worked. Statter eventually decided that the best chance was to walk in through the air on a day when the prison was distracted. The aircraft was a Bell 47, a small 2-seat helicopter, repainted to look exactly like one of the aircraft regularly used by the Mexican Attorney General. The pilot, an American named Roger Hirschner, flew low over Mexico City to avoid radar and dropped into the Santa Martha Acatitla yard during the evening film screening. Kaplan and his Venezuelan cellmate, a man named Carlos Antonio Contreras Castro, ran out of the cell blocks within seconds of the helicopter touching down. A guard reportedly tried to fire on them, and his weapon jammed. The helicopter was airborne again before any meaningful response was organized. From there, Kaplan and Contreras were flown to a small airstrip, where Kaplan transferred to a Cessna 210 piloted by Statter himself. The Cessna headed north toward the United States border. Contreras separately made his way back to Venezuela, his home country, where he disappeared into private life. Kaplan, by the time Mexican authorities realized he was gone, was already out of the country. What happened next is the part that confused everyone watching the case. Mexico did request, through the FBI, that Kaplan be arrested when he reached American soil. That request was sent on August 20th, 1971, 2 days after the escape. But Mexico never followed it up with a formal extradition request. Kaplan's lawyers argued that under Mexican law at the time, escape itself was not a crime as long as it didn't involve violence against guards. Nobody at Santa Marta Acatitla had been seriously injured. The legal logic, however unusual it sounds, was technically sound, and so Joel Kaplan, who had been serving a 28-year sentence for murder in a Mexican prison, lived out the rest of his life in the United States as a free man. He died in Miami in 1988, never recaptured, never returned to Mexico. The escape itself became the subject of a 1973 book titled The 10-Second Jailbreak, written by Elliot Asanoff, Warren Hinkle, and William W. Turner. Columbia Pictures adapted the story into the 1975 Charles Bronson film Breakout, although the studio described the screenplay as almost entirely fictional except for the escape sequence itself. The Kaplan story is what set the template for nearly every helicopter escape that came after it. Pascal Payet, Michel Vaujour, Vasilis Palaiokostas, Redouane Faïd. All of them, in some sense, were operating in a tradition that started in a prison yard in Mexico City on a Wednesday evening in the summer of 1971, while everyone inside was watching a movie. The next escape we're looking at didn't involve a helicopter, an accomplice, or even a weapon. It involved a pallet of mailbags, a breathing tube, and a man who would later be filmed talking his way out of a routine traffic stop while every law enforcement agency in the country was looking for him. Richard Lee McNair. There is a piece of dashcam footage from April 5, 2006, that became one of the most watched law enforcement videos of that decade. A police officer in Ball, Louisiana, has stopped a man walking on a set of railroad tracks. The man is in a tank top and shorts. He says he's a jogger working roofing jobs related to Hurricane Katrina relief. He gives the officer 2 different names, one after the other. He banters with the officer about how he hadn't realized he was crossing the tracks. After a few minutes of conversation, the officer lets him go. The man's actual name was Richard Lee McNair, and he had escaped from a federal maximum security prison earlier that same morning. McNair was born December 19, 1958, in Oklahoma. His father was a reserve police officer. His mother had served in the Air Force as a military policewoman. On November 17, 1987, during a botched grain elevator burglary in Minot, North Dakota, McNair shot and killed a truck driver named Jerome Theus and wounded a second man named Richard Kitzman. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 30 additional years. His own brother, Phil, would later tell journalists that Richard was about the smartest person he had ever met. Law enforcement officers who dealt with him directly tended to agree, with several noting that his real talent was getting people to lower their guard during ordinary conversation. That talent showed up first in February 1988. just months after his arrest. McNair was being interviewed in a police station in Minot. He was handcuffed to a chair. He had spent the morning quietly working a tube of lip balm out of his pocket. While the detectives were talking among themselves, he used the lip balm as a lubricant, slipped his hands free of the cuffs, and walked out of the room. He was recaptured within hours. It was, in retrospect, a warning that nobody acted on. His second escape came in 1992. By then, he had been transferred to a North Dakota State Correctional Facility, where he found his way into a ventilation duct that ran out of his cell block and ultimately out of the building itself. He dyed his hair, made his way south and west across the country, and stayed on the run for about 10 months before being recaptured in Grand Island, Nebraska, in 1993. After that, he was moved into the federal system and assigned to the United States Penitentiary at Pollock, Louisiana, a high-security facility deep in the central part of the state. He was given a job repairing damaged mailbags. That job was what made the third escape possible. Over a period of months, McNair quietly built what he later described as an escape pod, hidden inside a pallet of repaired mailbags. He fitted it with a breathing tube. He timed his entry into the pod for the exact moment when the warehouse workers handling the pallet would be taking their lunch break. On the morning of April 5, 2006, the pallet was loaded onto a forklift and driven out of the prison to a contracted warehouse outside the perimeter. McNair, sealed inside, cut himself free once the warehouse workers left the building. A few hours later, he was walking on the railroad tracks in the small Louisiana town of Ball when Officer Carl Bourdelon stopped him. The footage that followed became famous. Bourdelon, half laughing, asked the man on the tracks how lucky he could be to see someone running. McNair, calm and friendly, gave him a name, then a second name, then explained that he was a jogger doing relief roofing. Bourdelon eventually let him go, then realized within minutes that he had just talked to the man every police radio in the region was hunting. By the time officers swept the area, McNair was gone. He stayed on the run for roughly 18 months. He traveled across the United States and crossed into Canada. At one point during his time as a fugitive, he mailed a Christmas card to one of the prison wardens who had been looking for him. He later used that same warden's name as a reference when applying for a cell phone. He corresponded with a Canadian journalist named Byron Christopher, who would later publish a book based on those letters. Much of what is publicly known about McNair's time on the run comes from that correspondence. He was finally arrested on October 25, 2007, in Campbellton, New Brunswick, Canada. A rookie Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer flagged a suspicious van and ran the plates. McNair, who had been living quietly in the area under another assumed name, was taken into custody without resistance. He was extradited back to the United States and is now held at the ADX Florence Supermax in Colorado, the most restrictive prison in the federal system. He has not escaped from ADX Florence. To date, nobody has. What makes the McNair case stick with people is the dashcam footage. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a routine traffic stop with a convicted murderer in real time and listening to him talk a police officer into letting him walk away. You'd think someone would have run the names. Nobody did. And in that 2-minute window on a quiet Louisiana road, a man wanted by the entire federal system simply kept walking. The next case we're looking at is shorter in duration, but stranger in mechanics. It involves a 50-year-old South Korean thief, a few decades of yoga practice, and a hole in a cell door measuring less than 6 inches tall. Choi Gap-bok. In the early hours of September 17, 2012, a 50-year-old career thief named Choi Gap-bok rubbed skin ointment over his upper body, slid up against the cell door of his holding room in a Daegu police station and squeezed through a slot designed to pass food trays back and forth. The slot was about 5.9 inches tall and 17.7 inches wide. 3 guards were asleep within feet of him as he did it. By the time the morning shift discovered the empty cell, Choi was already several kilometers away, climbing into the mountains, and the South Korean police had a problem they could not initially even describe out loud. Choi was a career thief in his early 50s, head of a small theft ring, and by the time of his 2012 escape, he had spent roughly 23 years across various stretches of incarceration. He stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 115 pounds. He had practiced yoga consistently throughout his decades in detention, and his flexibility was, by every account from officers who later reviewed the surveillance footage, well outside what anyone would have considered humanly possible. For Choi, yoga had effectively been a long-term project carried out over decades, something he had been working toward with a specific eventual purpose. This was not his first escape. In 1990, he had broken out of a prisoner transport bus by slipping between its iron bars while the vehicle was in motion. He was recaptured 2 days later on that occasion, but the technique had already been established. By the time he was arrested again on September 12, 2012, on a new round of robbery charges and held at the Dongbu police station in Daegu, he had been thinking about how to get out of that specific holding cell for the better part of 3 days. What happened in the early hours of September 17th would later be described, in a quote that became famous in Korean press coverage, by a police investigator who reviewed the surveillance footage. The investigator said Choi had escaped the cell in less than a minute, moving flexibly like an octopus. That phrase, which translates almost exactly the same way into English, became the headline image of the case. Before he left, Choi did one more thing that suggested he had been preparing for this moment for years. He arranged pillows and bedding under his blanket on the bunk to create the silhouette of a sleeping body. He later told investigators that he had taken the idea directly from the film The Shawshank Redemption. He also left a small handwritten note on the bunk, which read, in essence, that he was sorry and that he was the framed thief Choi Gap-bok. He maintained throughout his recapture and trial that the charges against him in 2012 had been falsified. From the police station, Choi made his way to a nearby home, where he stole car keys and a credit card. He drove the vehicle until he reached an area with a police checkpoint, then abandoned the car and continued on foot into the mountainous countryside south of Daegu. South Korean authorities deployed roughly 400 officers, multiple helicopters, and tracking dogs into the area. The manhunt lasted 6 days. On September 22, 2012, officers found Choi hiding in a cardboard box on the rooftop of an apartment building in Miryang, about 30 kilometers south of Daegu. He was still insisting, when arrested, that he had been framed. He was returned to custody and held this time in a barless cell with no food slot. He was eventually sentenced to 7 years at his first trial in 2013, which was reduced on appeal to 6 years. The Choi Gap-bok case, in the years since, has become one of the most widely referenced prison escapes outside of Western media. It is not particularly long or particularly violent. The total amount of time he spent at large was less than a week, which compared to most of the other cases on this list is essentially nothing. And no, I'm not making that up. A man crawled through a slot the size of a small mailbox opening, and the South Korean prison system had to spend 6 days, 400 officers, and a fleet of helicopters to put him back. What makes the case land is the patience required to get to that moment, the yoga training that ran across 23 years of incarceration, the careful study of the cell dimensions during his 3 days in custody, and the decision to make pillow dummies the way it's done in a film he had watched and remembered. None of it was improvised, and all of it required time that nobody in the system had any reason to think he was using for that purpose. The next escape we're looking at also involved patience, but the patience was directed at a different kind of opportunity. It involved a death row inmate, a fake identification badge, and a walk past 4 separate jail employees out the front door of a building he was supposed to be transferred from in chains. Charles Victor Thompson. On the afternoon of November 3, 2005, a man walked out of the front door of the Harris County Jail in Houston, Texas. He was wearing civilian clothes. He waved an identification badge that read, U.S. Attorney General's Office, at the 4 jail employees he passed on his way out. He had been on death row for years. He had been sentenced to death by a Texas jury exactly 6 days earlier. His name was Charles Victor Thompson, and he is, by the count of every credible source, the only death row inmate to ever successfully escape a correctional facility in the United States during the 21st century. Thompson was born June 13, 1970. He was convicted in April 1999 and sentenced to death for the April 30, 1998, murders of his ex-girlfriend Glenda Dennis Hayslip, who was 39, and her new boyfriend Darren Keith Kane, who was 30. The killings happened at a home in the Tomball area of suburban Houston after a domestic disturbance escalated. Thompson left the residence, returned a short time later, kicked in the door, and shot Kane 4 times. He then reloaded and shot Hayslip in the face. She survived the initial injuries for approximately 1 week before dying from them. While awaiting his first trial, Thompson attempted to arrange the murder of a witness in the case, a woman named Diane Zernia. His original death sentence was overturned on a Sixth Amendment issue, but a second jury, in October 2005, sentenced him to death again. He was being held at the Harris County Jail in downtown Houston, pending transfer to the Polunsky Unit, which is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility that houses death row. While at the county jail, he had been given an attorney visit in a locked visitation booth. What jail staff did not know was that during his resentencing hearing the week before, Thompson had worn civilian clothes in court. After the hearing, those clothes had been returned to him and somehow ended up in his possession at the jail. They were not supposed to be there. When the attorney visit ended, Thompson removed his handcuffs, took off his orange jumpsuit, put on the civilian clothes underneath, and produced what appeared to be a U.S. Attorney General's Office identification badge. The badge was fake. He had made it himself or had had it made for him during his stay in the county system. He left the visitation booth, which was supposed to be locked, walked through a series of secured doors, past at least 4 different jail employees, and out the front door of the building. The Harris County Sheriff's Office would later describe the entire sequence as the result of multiple errors by jail personnel. Thompson made his way to a rail yard and boarded a freight train heading toward East Texas. He spent the next several hours riding in a boxcar. He later told investigators that he felt dirty and happy throughout the trip, and that the whole thing had felt like an adventure. He eventually disembarked in Shreveport, Louisiana. There, posing as an evacuee displaced by Hurricane Katrina, which had hit the region 2 months earlier, he obtained food, money, and assistance from local relief workers and bystanders. On November 6, 2005, 3 days after the escape, police acting on an anonymous tip found Thompson at a payphone outside a liquor store in Shreveport. He was intoxicated. He was attempting to arrange a wire transfer that would have funded a trip to Canada. When officers asked him to identify himself, he reportedly said that they already knew who he was. He waived extradition on the spot, telling a court official that he didn't want to waste Louisiana's taxpayer money. He was returned to Texas custody within hours. A sheriff's lieutenant named John Martin spoke to reporters during the manhunt and said, in essence, that Thompson should never have been able to walk out of that building, and that there was no scenario under which a man like him should have been free on the streets. Kane's brother, Devin Donaghy, used considerably blunter language in interviews, describing Thompson as a worthless piece of society. Thompson was returned to death row and remained there for the next 2 decades. About an hour before his scheduled execution, the United States Supreme Court issued a brief order rejecting his final appeal without comment. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 in the evening, Central Standard Time, on January 28, 2026, at the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville, by lethal injection of pentobarbital. He was the first U.S. execution carried out in 2026. His final words apologized to the families. He said there were no winners in the situation, that the execution created more victims, and that he was sorry for what he had done 28 years earlier. Hayslip's son, a man named Wade, told reporters afterward that the execution was the only thing Thompson had left to offer in terms of accountability for the lives he had destroyed. The escape itself, in retrospect, was almost embarrassingly simple. It came down to a locked door that wasn't actually locked, a fake badge that no one stopped to inspect, and a man walking confidently past employees who had no reason, in the moment, to question him. The last case on this list isn't simple, and it isn't quiet. It is one of the most consequential prison escapes in American legal history because of what the man at the center of it did during the 7 weeks he spent at large. Ted Bundy. On the morning of December 31st, 1977, the staff at a small county jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, walked past the cell of an inmate who appeared to be asleep on his bunk. He was not. He had climbed through the ceiling of the cell the night before, dropped into the empty apartment of the chief jailer, changed into civilian clothes, and walked out the front door of the building. The jail wouldn't realize he was gone for another 17 hours. By then, Theodore Robert Bundy had reached Chicago, and the 7 weeks that followed would produce some of the most consequential murders in American criminal history. Bundy is one of the most documented serial killers in modern history, with confessions to 30 homicides across 7 states between 1974 and 1978. The actual total is believed to be higher. By 1977, he was being held in Colorado in connection with the murder of a young nurse named Karen Campbell, who had been killed near Aspen in January 1975. He was acting as his own attorney for that case, a decision the court had allowed him to make. That arrangement gave him a privilege most inmates didn't have. He had access to the courthouse law library, and during library visits, he was not in restraints. The first escape happened on June 7, 1977, at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen. During a recess in his hearing, Bundy asked to use the law library on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. He was permitted to go alone. Inside the library, he opened a window and jumped. The drop was roughly 25 to 30 feet. He sprained his ankle in the fall, but kept moving. He fled into the mountains around Aspen, broke into a trailer at Maroon Lake, and then circled back toward the town itself. The escape triggered a town-wide panic in Aspen. Local press reported a run on firearm sales by women in the area. Maps later found in a car Bundy had stolen during the period indicated that the escape had been planned in advance and was not impulsive. He was recaptured 6 days later, on June 13th, after a sheriff's deputy spotted him driving erratically in the stolen vehicle. The deputy, recognizing him, reportedly greeted him by saying, "Welcome back, Ted." He was returned to custody, this time at the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, a smaller facility. He was held there pending trial. And in the months that followed, he began preparing for the second escape, which would be substantially more sophisticated than the first. The preparation was twofold. First, Bundy deliberately lost an estimated 20 to 25 pounds of body weight to be able to fit through a small opening he had identified in the ceiling of his cell. Second, he used a small hacksaw blade, which had been smuggled to him by other inmates over a period of weeks, to cut a roughly 1-foot square hole in the metal ceiling of the cell. He covered the work each evening with calendars and posters. Jail staff did not catch on. On the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy piled books and files under his blanket to create the silhouette of a sleeping body. He climbed into the crawl space through the hole in the ceiling. He worked his way across the ceiling structure of the jail and dropped down into the chief jailer's apartment, which was empty because the jailer was off duty for the holiday. He changed into civilian clothes from the apartment's closet, walked out the front door, and left Glenwood Springs. The escape was not discovered for approximately 17 hours. By the time it was, Bundy had hitchhiked to Vail, taken a bus to Denver, and boarded a flight to Chicago. From Chicago, he moved through Ann Arbor and Atlanta to Tallahassee, Florida, where he rented a room in a boarding house under an assumed name. On the night of January 15, 1978, 2 weeks after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy attacked the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were severely injured, but survived. He then attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in a nearby residence. She also survived. 3 weeks later, in February of 1978, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. Her life was taken, and her body was found 7 weeks afterward. He was arrested on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, after being pulled over in a stolen Volkswagen by an officer who didn't initially know who he was. He was held in the Pensacola City Jail, and within days, investigators connected him to the Chi Omega attacks and to Kimberly Leach. His trial for the Chi Omega murders, held in 1979, became the first nationally televised criminal trial in American history. He represented himself for part of it. He was convicted. At sentencing, Judge Edward Cowart imposed the death penalty with a set of remarks that have been quoted in nearly every legal write-up of the case since. The judge said the killings had been heinous, atrocious, and cruel. But he also addressed Bundy directly, saying that Bundy was a bright young man who would have made a good lawyer, that he would have loved to have him practice in his courtroom, but that Bundy had gone another way, partner. The judge ended by telling him to take care of himself, and that he felt no animosity toward him personally. That last passage, almost casual in its tone, has been studied by legal scholars for decades as an example of how a presiding judge can simultaneously condemn a defendant to death and acknowledge, in human terms, the loss the defendant himself represented. Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair on January 24, 1989. The case, for purposes of this list, is about the second escape. The first one, the window jump, was reckless and amateurish, and he was caught within a week. The second one, with the planned weight loss, the hacksaw blade, the silhouette of books under a blanket, the empty apartment, and the 17-hour delay before anyone noticed he was gone, is the one that matters. Because by the time the Garfield County Jail discovered the empty cell, Bundy was in Florida. Within weeks, 3 young women were dead, and a 12-year-old girl had been taken. The escape, in other words, did exactly what an escape is supposed to do from the inmate's perspective. The cost of that fact is what makes it different from every other case on this list. That's the full list. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.